Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 58th video in our Master Series, the 28th video in our first phase processing, and the first video on reverberation and bodybuilding. And while I'm doing processing, at this point I call this bodybuilding because, well, this can have two aspects and two functions because a lot of times that in my chain, in my processing chain, at this point, I'm doing bodybuilding. Now, also mixed in with this, I might be doing reverberation and a little more aggressive spatialization. And to try to clear that up is that besides all the sound sculpting we've been doing and things like that, reverberation, convolution reverbs, and standard reverbs, any kind of reverb that isn't really affecting the sound other than just spatialization, that they can have a huge effect on the thickness and fullness of the sound. So it's basically what any type of reverberation or delays do or things like that is they start multiplying the sound and duplicating it and causing it to sound fuller. Now, with very light applications of that, what you get is this really super lush, full sound. Now, the other side of that is causing actual spatialization. So I'm going to kind of clear that up. So to make a point to make it really clear is that at this point in my processing that I'm doing bodybuilding, but I also might make a decision here to do spatialization, and I'll try to explain that. Is that, let's say that I don't just want bodybuilding but I actually want it to sound like it's in this space. So, and I've chosen this space, it's like a jazz hall or something like that. So besides the bodybuilding, when I get done with the bodybuilding of it, then I'm also at the end of that going to put on some type of convolution reverb with some type of impulse response or something like that, that very lightly, because, a little bit adds up. So if you do this, you're going to want to do this to all your tracks so they all sound like they're in the same place. Sometimes you add a little bit more if you got things farther back to give it depth. But you understand the difference because then it's put in its place and you can actually hear the sound of there being reverberation. Like, no, that sounds like it's in a room, like a medium-sized room or a big room or a little teeny room, and you've really brought the reverberation in there to cause that type of an effect. That's different than bodybuilding. So basically, most of the time, I don't have a note on here, but I guess I should make a note when I'm teaching and for myself, because it can get confusing. Because let's say you're listening to a song on the radio and you hear the vocalist, and she sounds nice and rich and full, but you're not really hearing her in some space. She's like some pop star, and it doesn't sound like she's in a jazz club or a hall or a concert hall or any other place. She just sounds nice and clear, like she's singing a song, and your brain is not really registering that she's in some type of room. It's not the work that they've done on it with the reverberations isn't making you hear that, take that into consideration. So it's a clue that a lot of times they don't use it that way. And sometimes they hardly use it at all, but I use it for bodybuilding. Now, whether or not some people do or not is kind of, I don't know. You can ask around and see how they use it, but this is how I use it, because I've learned that if I use it real lightly for bodybuilding, reverbs, and light delays, that it adds richness to the sound, but you don't really hear reverberation. You're not hearing reverberation. You're here like listening to the vocalist on a pop song or any kind of song, and you're just hearing a good, full, rich sound that sounds nice and clear coming out the speakers, but your brain's not really perceiving that it's in some space or some club or concert hall or anything like that. So that's the first thing that I'm trying to do, and that's the bodybuilding that I'm using my reverberations for and my delays. And when I get done with that, we'll talk about that also, that I might have made my decision that I'm going to put it in some kind of space. Now, I might make a decision to do that here, or I might put it on all the tracks. The difference between that is that if you put it lightly, like let's say you want all the tracks to sound like they were recorded in some jazz club, and you've got your convolution reverb out, and you've chosen that jazz club. Now, if you really make that vocalist sound, let's say you're working on the vocal track like they're really in that jazz club, back off on it, because too much of it, when it starts mixing with all the other tracks that you've done that to, it'll start causing mud. So it might sound like you're going light on it, but when you mix them all together, it'll really sound good. It's like you figure about that much sounds good, and back off some, and sometimes that I won't render that. Most of my processing I render, but when I do that, I a lot of times won't render it, because when I start mixing those tracks together, and I've chosen that they're all going to be in this certain space, and I'm using that same convolution reverb to convey that I'm going to have to start adjust them. I certainly don't want to have them rendered, because on that bass and or on that guitar and on that vocals, I might be setting them a little different. And when I got background vocals, I might add a little bit more there because they're farther back or something like that, and the drummer's farther back a little bit. I might add them in a little bit differently. The same convolution reverb, the same impulse response, so that it conveys the same space, and the mathematical convolution on those audio files is the same. That way you don't get conflicting mathematics that caused mud. Does that make sense? And it's a really huge concept to get in your head. So I hope that doesn't sound too confusing, but for the first part of this, we're going to do some bodybuilding, so you can actually see what I mean, that it's a sound sculpting tool, but it's a little bit differently. And I have it separate from my EQ. I do it after my equalization, because once I've got it equalized good and it sounds really good after my sound sculpting, and I've done that as much as I can, then I want to build some body on that, because now for the most part, that most of my processing is done on my track, and it's sculpted to where it sounds as good as it's going to get for the most part. And so the next thing is I want to add body to it. I want to make it sound thicker and fuller and richer, and I don't want it to get muddy, so I don't want to add a lot, but I want it to sound as thick and rich as full as possible. And reverberations and things like that and convolution reverbs, they're multiplying mathematics of only the things that are inherent in the sound itself and the impulse response. So you got to kind of be careful about that, but the concept is what it's supposed to be doing is just multiplying the sound itself and making it cause richer. And the more you add it, it starts sounding like this is in a huge space, because of all the reflections coming back at you. It starts adding huge depth to it. So you don't want to do that. You just want to add body. So you're using its own harmonic content to make it sound thicker, richer, and fuller. So you've done a really good job on your processing by now, getting it to where it's like almost perfect. It's like it sounds so good. I did such a good job sculpting all this other work, and my equalization work has done so well. Now I just want to make it sound nice and thick and full without mudding it, and that's where this comes in. So we'll do that first. We'll take a look at that, and then we'll make a decision on whether or not we're going to put it in some place. So we're going to choose a jazz club or something like that, and then we'll talk about that a little bit. Most of the time, once I get done with that, then I'll just leave that off until I'm done with all their tracks. When I start mixing and I really want all the instruments to sound like they're recorded in this jazz club or this concert hall or whatever, I'm using the same reverb, the same convolution reverb with the same impulse responses on those tracks together and blending it in a little bit. Not too much, because it doesn't take much. If you do a bunch on one track and you do a bunch on all the tracks, it's going to sound like a muddy mess. But if you go light on each one of the tracks and then blend them together, it's got this cool effect. Does that make sense? So it's a work in progress, and it takes practice, and it takes some experience of fussing around with it until you understand it and are able to use it well. But hopefully by the time we get done doing our bodybuilding here and then choosing a space to put our instrument and our track in, that it should become pretty obvious what we're trying to do, and then it's just going to take some experimentation. And plus, as we go through the whole production, you doing all the rest of the phases, that it will become really apparent of what you're trying to do and why we're doing things the way we do. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to bodybuilding and spatialization and the reverberation aspects of spatialization, and I will see you in the next video when we take a look of actually applying it to some audio.